Welcome to another edition of The Human Project, an expanded and deeper view of what Marxism is all about, introducing aspects that I think are left out of most Marxist discussions. So in a previous talk, I talked about historical materialism, the understanding that history is human history. It's us humans evolving. It isn't just the evolution of economic systems. It's just that's the framework for our evolution. So a central idea of Marxism, and this I think hasn't received enough attention, is that the next phase of evolution, requires that we know who we are, that we have a scientific understanding of what and who we are, how we came to be who we are, and of our future evolution. So if we look at previous evolutions from one form of society to another, they didn't have that. So going from feudalism to capitalism, they did develop the idea of, the individual, of human rights, of, the natural rights of man, so on and so forth. But that's about as far as they got. And we'll get into this in a little more detail. But for us to evolve to the next stage requires us really to understand who and what we are. And this is the whole point of the science of history, which is the science also of human being in its evolution. And unfortunately, in discussions, philosophical discussions of Marxism and economic, this central point is left out. But it's absolutely central. And it's important to read Engels, because Engels is the one who sort of philosophizes about what Marxism is all about. Marx himself was more busy doing Marxism, but Engels often sort of stepped out of it and talked about it. So, but this is a point that he emphasized repeatedly, that we're now able to evolve further because we're starting to know who we are. So in a previous talk, I talked about our, forms of knowledge, and I'll go into that in a little more detail. And I gave the example of gravity, the apple falling from the tree, and how previously, I don't know what they thought. I don't know if people were sitting around, saying, gosh, we're so tired of these dark ages. We don't know anything. We're so dumb. We don't even know why the apple's falling from the tree. We just can't explain anything. We can't wait until the Enlightenment comes along and so we can start knowing things and so on. I don't think people were thinking that. They were just in whatever they were in. And so same thing today. We're in whatever we're in. But then if we look at the evolution, it's very interesting that it really was over hundreds of years that sort of a new concept of knowledge developed, a new concept of the subject, of the object, of science, that all sort of evolved together over a period of hundreds of years. So when Descartes came along, I think, therefore I am, that didn't just drop out of the sky. That was something that had sort of evolved. But it didn't just, if you're a Marxist, you say, well, it didn't just evolve in the world of ideas. It evolved because there really was an evolution of the subject, of our form of consciousness. So our form of consciousness evolved to the point where it seemed to be in this one person. And then the idea of a person evolved. So that seemed to be like, okay, a person enclosed in this body. And so we started getting what's called naturalism, where it seems so natural. Okay, you got a body, you got a person, you got a consciousness, it all goes together, it's all a package, and it's always been that way. And as Marx showed, or one of the things he tried to show, it hasn't always been that way, and that's actually what seems to be this independent, isolated individual, natural individual, is actually the product of the most complex social evolution. So this seemingly natural individual comes about as a result of a more complex form of society. Well, I'm giving the general idea. At some point we'll have to go into that, obviously in more detail. But I'll have to admit, I don't know if anybody really knows much more detail. Now, Marx, in his Grundrisse, he gets more into this, of showing how capitalism produces this fiction of an individual. But anyway, the point is, once we're aware of this, then we can start looking, okay, what's going on now? What are we seeing? Now that we see that this individual is a social product, what dynamic can we see? Where is it headed? And if we start looking closely, we do start seeing, well, first of all, we see the evolution. Like that individual, the sort of disembodied subject, like here I am as a subject, my subjectivity just exists inside of me somewhere. Of course, that first pertained to white middle class or upper class men. So, and it was really more, I have, therefore I am. I own property, I have things, therefore I am as a being. And it always bothers me, these Western movies. Normally I like Westerns, but you got this like Yellowstone with Kevin Costner, who normally I really like. But there's a million of these. It's all about these men with property and egos, and it's like their ego and their property, it's all tied in, it's all one thing. And that's more and more, I can't watch that. It's just annoying. And, because that's what it was all about. So first, the I am was connected to I have. And so it's the people who have are the ones who am or are. And then gradually it's like, okay, women, I guess we can call them, selves and, beings. I guess we'll let them be qualified as that. And then, another 100 years, it's like, okay, people of color, maybe we'll grant them their own subjectivity. And, we all know that shows up in movies where up until not that long ago, women and people of color were not granted, they couldn't be central. They couldn't have their really own subjectivity. They sort of orbited around the ones who did have subjectivity, which is the middle class and upper class white males. We all know that by now. But then the question is, okay, so let's say it's been more or less equalized, even though it's not. Where are we going now? Is this just, okay, for the whole rest of eternity, this is the way it's going to be? Or is this form of being, this form of selfhood, connected with owning things, and connected to, here's me, here's my consciousness, is that eternal or is it changing? And I think if we look real closely, we do see some ways that it's starting to change. People are starting to get, uncomfortable with the idea of having just one identity that's just fixed. And people want many identities, or they want a more fluid identity. So we're starting to see some kind of breakdown of this, this particular form of identity that we have. And, if we look at Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, they actually spell it out to a certain extent, and I'll get into that in another talk, about how we're going to transcend all forms of society, forms of identity, forms of social relations. So this is a whole area that I feel Marxists haven't paid enough attention to. And it's time we started to, and I'm hoping in these talks to, open this discussion. Here I'll have to confess, many years ago I had ambitions to really make much more progress in thinking about this, and thinking about, okay, how did this form of being come about? And why is it that it came about in capitalist relations? And then what's going to change? Well, I can't say I got too far with it, but there are some beginnings of how capitalism produced the commodity, which is a particular form of being, of things, and at the same time, I think it produced a form of being of people in much the same way. And so we have to look at, okay, what were the relations? What's that production process? And If you look here, if you look at the spiritual traditions, the Buddhist idea of enlightenment, Hindu idea of what do you call it? The reuniting of Atman and Brahman, Christian idea of the kingdom of God, the ancient Egyptian idea of Ma'at. They're all tied, in some ways to the surpassing of property. Maybe not so much for the Egyptians, but in the surpassing of the ego, the self. For Buddhism, for instance, to reach a higher state of consciousness, you need to let go of the self. Well, the self, like I said, is very tied to property. And so maybe a society that's transcended private property, that has, where we don't base our sense of self on who owns what, maybe that's the way this is going to happen, the way we get to a higher form of being. And certainly Marx and Engels believed that, and they spelled it out in the Communist Manifesto. So I think that's going to have to be my next discussion. But I just wanted to kind of go back in history in the other direction and point out, again, so Marx and Engels said, as we produce in society, so we produce ourselves. And like I said, that sounds like just sort of a truism that we don't even have to think about until we wonder, well, wait, how did that happen? And then we see that what they meant was we enter into relations of production. And so those relations then have a life of their own. They're alive, as I said in the previous talk, so they have a dynamic. So then we become part of that dynamic. So this is also something I'll get into in more detail another time. So let's say we look at the original humanization. And from what I can see in my research, I didn't ask AI about this, but just other forms of research. What made us human? And it's still being debated. We still don't have the answer. Okay, the two extremes, we have creation, God made us human. The other extreme is like, okay, we evolved. Both of those, they're just not the whole picture. And I think I would have to agree with the creationists that the idea that we just sort of evolved biologically, and then at one day we woke up and it's like, oh, now I'm human. And isn't that great to be human? I can think, I can write. Well, I don't write yet, but I can talk, communicate in much more complex ways, and have sex all the time, unlike animals that are tied to particular cycles and so on. So isn't this great? I'm human. I don't think it didn't happen that way. So biological evolution was one aspect. It set the precondition. But then what made us human? And I think, well, okay, if we're Marxists, Marx said the human essence is the ensemble of societal relations, which meant the relations of production. So we can say what made us human is when we evolved into relations of production, or a production process that had enough complexity that involved relations, which, in my humble opinion, created temporality. Because then time, or human temporality, as opposed to natural temporality. So we all know, see now anthropologists, they talk about natural temporality, but they don't talk about the temporality of human production and human society. So when we entered into temporality, we entered into relations, then we began to be human. And so first, obviously, we had to have the capacity, having evolved to the capacity. But the evolution itself didn't do it. And that's why the creationists really have a point. They say that biological evolution just does not explain how we became human. And I think they're right. Of course, I don't agree that it was, God came along and decided, okay, time to make them human. But the evolution was just the capacity. Then something human happened that made us human. So then, but the really interesting thing is that, so from the beginning, we're dual beings. we're operating on two tracks. One is our individual biological self, which obviously that's how human is manifested in these biological beings. But at the same time, human life, in a sense, is the life of this essence, the life of this dynamic ensemble of relations, which, as I said in an earlier talk, must be seen as alive, not biological life, but human life, a life form that's making us who we are. So this is what I believe Marxism adds to the picture. It hasn't really been seen until this Lucien Sèvres, the French philosopher I'll be mentioning very often, came along and pointed it out. So he said the basis of our life as human beings is this ensemble of relations, and our biological being is the support, or it's the realization of that basis, but it's the relations of production that is the human life in itself. And I know that's a little hard to see, but I'll be returning to this very often because I think it explains so much, like religion, forms of consciousness, things like that. Also, it explains when people became humans, their first thought was, hey, isn't this great to be human? I can do all these things. Their thought is, oh my God, what just happened? I got dropped out of this paradise where I was living with the Great Spirit, and all the animals were running around singing and dancing, and people all were having a great time, and the Great Spirit was, kind of grooving with all of us. And so now here I am. What is this? Can't think straight, can't see straight. Everything is problematic. There's all this conflict and death. So all humans, it seems, came into the world thinking that, or at least the original humans. So why did they think that? So then they said, oh, wow, I wish we could get back to that paradise time when everything was groovy. But all the anthropologists in the world have never found that. They've never found the Shangri-La or that place, and each culture had their own name for it. We know the Garden of Eden, we know Shangri-La. I know all the Native Americans had their name for it. It was all, where the Great Spirit dwells, and we used to dwell with the Great Spirit. And why does everybody have this idea? And it's certainly never been found. It's like, oh, here it is. And people have looked for Shangri-La. They haven't looked for the Garden of Eden, I don't know. I don't think. They haven't looked for heaven on earth. But so that place never existed, but all the original humans had the idea that it did. Why? I think I'm going to end that on this note, and we'll continue it another time.